Welcome all, karibu to my YouTube channel at Swahili Bongo DV Local. On today's videos, I want to share with you who to include in your DV Local application. That means which family member must be included in your DV entry. So stay with me until the end of this video so that you can be aware of whom to include in your application. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, Swahili Bongo DV Lotal, and share this video to others so that they can be aware on who to include during their application. So let's go and see who to include as the instruction provided. The instruction of the VLOTAL 2023 provide the list of family members to be included in your DV entry. The first one is your spouse, and the second one is your children. Those are the family members that you must be include them during your initial DV Lotal application. So let's see on part of spouse. On part of a spouse, you are legal married spouse should be included in your application. You must list spouse. You must list your spouse even if you are currently separated from him or her, unless that separation is through the court order. That's number one. If you have a spouse, means you have married someone, but because of some misunderstandings, you decide to separate from each other. But remember, legal separation is through court order. If you two decided to separate, it is okay, but during the application, you will be required to include your spouse who you have been separated, unless such separation is through the court order. That's number one. Also, failure to list your eligible spouse or listing someone who is not your spouse will render you ineligible for diversity visa. If you have listed someone who is not your spouse, or you have failed to list someone who is your spouse, and you have made your application, and luckily enough you have been selected, during the interview you might be denied a diversity visa because you have failed to list your spouse. Another thing to note is if you are not married at the time of entry, if you have not married at the time of entry, but you have planned to getting married in the future, do not list a spouse on your initial entry form, as this would make you ineligible for the diversity visa. For example, you have someone you have been staying with him or her for such a long time, and maybe you have a child with, but you didn't have get married legally. It means you two have not been married, but you have lived together for such a long time. You are not allowed to include such a person, because if you did so, you might be ineligible for diversity visa if you have been selected. That is a second issue. But another issue is if you have been divorced or your spouse is a deceased, you do not have to include or list such a spouse. I'm going to repeat this point. If you are divorced or your spouse is a deceased, you do not have to list your former spouse. Another point on a spouse is the only exception to this requirement is that if your spouse is already a US citizen or US lawful permanent resident, you will not be required to include such a spouse in your application. But if you can include him, there is no penalty on such thing. I'm going to repeat also this point. If your spouse is already a US citizen or a US lawful permanent resident, you are not obliged to include such a spouse during your application. But even if you include that spouse, it will not render you, or it is not going to be penalized during the interview time. That is on the part of your spouse. Let's go see another family member who should be included during your application. Children. Children is one among the family member you should include during your application. During your application, you must include all the living children who are unmarried and under 21 years of age at the time of your initial DV entry, and where and whether they are natural children, your stepchildren, or legal adopted children, all must be included during your application. I'm going to give clarification on this point. On the part of children, the children who you are allowed to include during your application, one, are those children who are unmarried. Second, those children who are under 21 years of age. Third, children who are biological children to yourself, your stepchildren, even if you have been divorced from the child parents, you are required to include them. Also, the legally adopted child. And when I say the legally adopted child, it means the child which or whose have been adopted legally through the laws of your countries. So those are the people who you are supposed to include during your initial application or during your DV Lottery application. But remember this, or you have to take into consideration this point. Parents and siblings of the entrant are ineligible to receive the diversity visa as dependent, and you should not include them in your entry. If you are living with maybe your niece, your cousins, your nephew, or you have your parents, during your application, you are not allowed to include this family member who are parents, siblings, and other family members except your spouse and children. So during your application, do not include parents, siblings, or you have living you have adopted you have a child from maybe your neighbor or what. Do not include those who are not your lawful children or your lawful spouse. So those are the family members that you are supposed to include during your application. Thank you for being with me until the end of this video. Don't forget to subscribe and share this video so that others can be aware on who to include the family member during the application of the DV lottery. Asante sana.